Hello, welcome to the Bible Standard. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop a comment in the comments area if you have any questions. We'll do our best to reply.
So in the previous class, we saw the problem the nation of Israel faced. They were slaves living under bondage. No strength of their own, they could not escape. Well, chapter 6 is the starting of the process of bringing them out of the house of bondage into the wilderness. Now, verse 5, God says, I've heard the groanings of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage. And therefore he says, now is the time, verse 6, that I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians and rid you out of their bondage. So God's heard their cries, and he's put a plan in motion to bring them out of the trials that they're facing. Now, we already looked at verses 6 to 8. It's this repetitive language, I will bring you out, I will bring you out, I will bring you out. But in the middle of this language, he says this, I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. So he speaks of the bringing the nation out of Egypt as a redemption. It's a process to bring them out. Now, the Hebrew word for redeemed here is the word goel. It's often translated as redeem, redemption, purchase, ransom, but it's also translated as the near kinsman. Now, the near kinsman is an important role in Eastern culture, especially in the biblical times. And it was often the role a family member would take to fulfill important matters regarding a family or an extended family. And so the intent of this class is kind of look at two roles associated with the near kinsman that can help us understand what God is doing for the nation of Israel and bringing them out of Egypt. And now, in fact, does anyone know what the two roles of the near kinsman is under the law? Well, the first one is the near kinsman as a deliverer. And that one probably comes to mind. The second one is the role of the Avenger. Let's start with the role of the deliverer. Let's go to Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25 is the laws of poverty, debt, and redemption. Now, the first thing I think you notice when you come into Leviticus 25 are the links that go back to Exodus chapter 6. So, for instance, the Hebrew word goel is used some 16 times in this chapter. Just look at verses 24 to 26. Redemption, redeem, 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 and so on. Look at verses 48 to 49. Redeem, redeem, redeem. So a key component of Leviticus 25 is this word redeem or redemption. Secondly, it directly references the language of Exodus 6. Look at verse 38. I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of a land of Egypt to give you Canaan and to be your God. That's Exodus 6, verse 6 to 8. Well, again, in verse 42, ye are my servants whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. Verse 55, ye are my servants whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. And so the law is bringing our attention back to Exodus chapter 6. Now, the implication of these statements that God brought them out of the land of Egypt implies that they were to remember that they were slaves in Egypt. Therefore, that should affect the way that they live, because they should treat others, especially their servants, with dignity and respect and all the things they wish they had when they were slaves. But what I think it shows is that the foundation of Leviticus 25 is based upon their experiences of bondage in Egypt. Now, the purpose of this law, of any law, really, is to teach us something. And in this case, it was to teach them on how to deal with the poor. In every society, poverty is inevitable. In fact, In our society, we see examples of families that seem to be in perpetual poverty. Some families and some communities. It's a real problem that you can see in the world today. Now, sometimes poverty is self-inflicted. It's by the choices that we make. Other times, it's maybe out of our control. But what I find interesting is this law teaches us to take responsibility for our debt. Now, all of these laws are structured around the concept called the right to, that we call the right to redeem. Now, this means that you can, if you were to mortgage off or pawn your property or possessions for a period of time, you could buy it back or you could reclaim it once you've paid off your debt. So we have an example of this. Look at verse 24. He says, all the land of your possessions ye shall grant a redemption for the land. That's this concept or the law of the right to redeem. So when your debt is paid off to whoever the creditor is, your property is restored back to you for the price that you were in debt for. Now, when we read through this, the law of redemption applies to the land. It applies to their possessions. Now, to houses, there's some legality according to the houses, but as well as to servitude. And when you read through this law, there's 3 ways to redeem. There was the year of Jubilee, there was by yourself, or the aspect of the near kinsman. Now, when we look at the ways of redemption, most of it was figured around the year of Jubilee. Because if you came in hardships and you were 20 years away from the year of Jubilee, your debt would be calculated at so much. Because at the year of Jubilee, all debt is forgiven. And it's almost like a cycle that you get to restart. And hopefully, in the second year cycle, you or your family would be a little bit more appropriate with your debt. Because the law taught you're responsible for your debt. But our focus right now is on this third way. This is the near kinsman. This is the concept that's going to bring our minds back to Exodus chapter 6. So we have an example of this in verse 47. If a sojourner or a stranger wax rich by thee, and thy brother that dwells by him wax poor, and sell himself, whether unto the stranger or to another brother in the community, because he has to work, he has to sell himself because he has debt. Well, he needs to work to pay off that debt, and so in some cases he might have to sell himself into servitude. Well, verse 48 informs us that he that is sold may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. Verse 49, an uncle, an uncle's son, or any nigh of kin. This is describing the role of the near kinsman, who can step in and pay off the debt and release a family member from servitude. And so I find this fascinating because even on the near kinsman side, it shows an act of compassion to free your brother from debt. And so just to put yourselves in the shoe of the debtor, let's just say I had to sell one of my daughters into servitude just to pay off family debt so the rest of us can survive to the year of Jubilee, let's say, just so we can afford the necessities of life. And this is a practical example of what would have happened at that time. But now my daughter is living away from home because she's in the house of whoever I'm in debt to. And so she can't enjoy family events. She has no freedom. She can't start her family. She can't do anything because she's in servitude to another family. And then one day, let's say, and most of you maybe know my brother Dan, let's just say he comes along and says, Kev, I've got you. I'm going to pay off your debt. I will take on the role of the near kinsman. And so he goes to the creditor and he pays the amount that I owed, my responsibility, that he paid that off for me. So my daughter is now free. Can you imagine the scenario, how you would feel? It'd be a very emotional time, wouldn't it? It'd be full of thanks and gratitude to my brother who extended his kindness in playing the role of the near kinsman. And even from the aspect of the near kinsman, what greater gift or experience can you provide than to free a brother or sister from bondage? And this is the role of the near kinsman, this goel. He's portrayed as a deliverer out of bondage. And we get this idea of a remarkable act of compassion and love. Turn with me to Psalm 74, because this law is illustrating what God did for the nation of Israel. As their near kinsman, he delivers them out of bondage and death. So Psalm 74 and verse 2, look how the psalmist puts this. He says, remember thy congregation, which thou hast purchased of old, the rod of thy inheritance, which thou hast. Sorry, I'm out of sync here. Yeah. Which thou hast redeemed. So here you see the language of the near kinsman, of God, as Israel's near kinsman, right? He purchased them out of bondage, right, to be his inheritance, and in fact, to be a part of his family, so they can enjoy their freedom in their inheritance. Now, one last interesting observation from Leviticus 25. Look at these remarks. Leviticus 25. Oh, it is. This comment on servants, Leviticus 25, verse 38. I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. So I am the Lord your God. I will be your God. Look at verse 42. Ye are my servants. And then verse 55, it puts both these together. They are my servants whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. What is this? This is language of possession. They were the servants of Egypt, which were slaves under bondage and death. But what did God do? He purchased them. And so the implication is, you're no longer servants to Egypt, but you're now my servants. And therefore, they need to serve God. Now, this distinction is built into this law because there's a difference made between those who God redeemed, the children of Israel, and whom he terms the strangers. Look at verse 46. And ye shall take them there is the strangers in the land. These are not Israelites. These are not those who have been redeemed by God. As an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But you need to treat the children of Israel a different way. And so what we see here, the law of redemption, the year of Jubilee and so on, does not apply to strangers in the land. Why? They've not been redeemed by God, so the law doesn't apply to them. And so there's this distinction built into the law between the Israelite and the stranger. And I think if we take a step back, this highlights the importance of being associated with the redemptive process. And we know this is going to bring us to Christ and to baptism and so on. Now, as we think about this concept of the near kinsman, where would you go in scriptures to see this outplayed? What's a good Old Testament story of the near kinsman in action? Any suggestions? Yeah. Naomi, Boaz, and Ruth. So let's go to Ruth chapter 1. Let's see this story in action on the near kinsman. Ruth chapter 1, Naomi returns home to Bethlehem. And in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 21, as Ruth comes back into the city, she sees her friends that she left behind. She says in verse 21, I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Naomi has a problem. Her husband and her sons died in Moab. She's old, and she's on the path to what? She's on the path to poverty. It's the same thing with Ruth. She left everything she had in the land of Moab. Any wealth she had, right? Her family, any comforts of life, she left in Moab to join Naomi, to go back to Bethlehem, to Israel, But the question is, who is going to support Naomi and Ruth? Well, at first, it's the law. The law is going to provide for them. So in chapter 2 and verse 2, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go down into the field and glean ears of corn." And so she's citing, no doubt through Naomi, the law, because the law is going to take care of her. In Leviticus chapter 19, it commanded that landowners were to leave the gleanings, right, leave some leftover of the food for the poor, because the law taught you had to take care of the poor in the land. And so they're gathering food, but the harvests only last for so long. Ruth can only gather so much food. But what about the other daily necessities of life? Rent, clothes, and whatever else you need to survive at that time. So it's very likely what's going to happen. Right? The imagery, the picture being built here, Ruth and Naomi, they're on their path to poverty. They're going to build up debt among their neighbors. And so if you have debt, you're going to become a servant. Now, this is a greater problem for Ruth than it is for Naomi, because if Naomi becomes a servant, right, she can be redeemed. She can go free in the year of Jubilee. But Leviticus 25, what about the stranger? This is not so clear with Ruth, is it? Because technically, legally speaking, the stranger could not be redeemed. And so the question in the book of Ruth, is it Ruth the Moabitess, or is she the wife of Mahlon? This is the question that comes up in this book. And this is left up to interpretation of the law. And I guess maybe, how do we see Ruth? Well, look at we know if you go to chapter 4 and verse 6, the nearer kinsman than Boaz, what did he say? He had no problem redeeming the land. But when Boaz says, you got to redeem Ruth as well, how does he respond? 4 verse 6, I can't redeem her, lest I mar mine own inheritance. He saw Ruth not as the wife of Mahlon, but as a stranger. She's a Moabite. She's going to defile me and my lineage. Right? So this begs the question, when we look at the law, how do we read it? We're very legalistic in our approach, or do we look at it by principles? And it's a very good thought, and it's a very good exercise that we all need to keep in the back of our mind. But regardless, the stakes for Ruth are high at this time. Now it's interesting, go back to chapter 2, verse 2. She says, I'm going to go out to the field because the law provides for me, but then she adds a piece on there. She's going into a field in whose sight I shall find grace. Well, I didn't teach that. And so this shows a growing understanding in Ruth. She's developing, she's understanding the truth. The law provides for the poor, but she's looking for grace. And isn't that the spirit of the law? Paul says, by grace are ye saved. So it's fascinating. We got Ruth, the Moabite, the stranger, if you will. She's looking for help. She's looking for a savior. She's looking for what? A near kinsman to provide for her. And so you can imagine the joy, the excitement between these two women when Naomi realizes God's hand at work in their lives. Look at verse 20. When she comes back and says, whose field were you in? I was in this man named Boaz. Ruth had no idea. What does Naomi say? That man is of near kins to us. He is our next kinsman. That's the Hebrew word goel. He's our redeemer. He can provide them grace, right? Redeem them from debt, bondage, and servitude. Now, we know the story. Boaz, the just man that he was, he followed the law, right? And he takes it to the city gates, chapter 4 and verse 3. He brings it to the city gates. This is where the elders sit at that time to judge the matters. And he takes it to the city gates and he sits them down and he says, Naomi's come back out of Moab and she sells a parcel of land, which was our brother Elimelech. So he's citing Leviticus 25. He's prepared to buy Naomi's land so she has income to survive to the year of Jubilee. He's looking after his family member. He's taken the principles of the near kinsman and he's living it. Now look in verse 4. Look at the emphasis of his words. I thought to advertise it to thee, to the near kinsman, before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. If you will not redeem it, then tell me, if there's none to redeem it besides thee, but I am after thee, and I will, the near kinsman said, I will redeem it. How many times? 5 times. It goes back to that concept of grace that's being shouted to us in the record, because this is what Ruth and Naomi are looking for. They're looking for grace. And so Boaz, we know, is the one who purchased it. But look in verse 10. Boaz says, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased. That's language Leviticus 25. This is the language of redemption. And for what purpose? He goes, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be no more cut off from among his brethren. Now it's interesting, in Ruth chapter 1, how does the book start? It starts with the name of dead men. Well, how does it end? It ends with living names who are in the lineage of Christ. Unless I mar my inheritance, Boaz says, no, there's something going on here. And they end up becoming the lineage of Christ. But you have the dead names and you have living names. And isn't this the redemptive process? We're dead in sin. We have nothing. But in Christ, in the near kinsman, there is life. So this is remarkable, these types and these imageries being produced in this book. And Ruth and Boaz are a great example of this principle. Through grace, one can deliver a family out of death and bondage. And again, Ruth becomes the lineage of Christ. And the nation of Israel had to learn to see God as their near kinsman, their Goel, who through grace brought them out of bondage and death to inherit land, the life, and be a part of his family. And remember, it wasn't anything Israel did. It's because he loved their fathers. He did this. And this is one aspect of the near kinsman, is to deliver out of bondage into the family of God. Now, what was that second role of the near kinsman? Do you remember that word I used? The Avenger. So the Avenger of blood. So you know where we're going. So let's go to Numbers 35. This is the second role of the near kinsman under the law. So this is Numbers chapter 35. And verse 19. Here's our word goel, or the word for redeemer. 35 verse 19. The revenger of blood. That's the word goel. Now what's the context of Numbers 35? It's the cities of refuge. These are 6 cities that were designated throughout the land. And what was their purpose of these cities? What was to judge issues in the land? And specifically, or the primary thing, was to judge murder. Verse 33, ye shall not pollute the land wherein ye are, for blood defiles the land. The land cannot be cleansed of blood that's shed by it, and by the blood except by the blood of him that shed it. Now the term blood here implies murder. That's just what the imagery, the point of it is. And so the point is, if there's murder in the land, it defiles the land. And therefore, what does he say at the end? You need to put the murderer to death. Now this goes back to the law. Let's go back to, just keep your finger here and go back to Genesis chapter 9. And so the law is citing what God told Noah after the flood. We know God brought the flood upon the earth because it was violent. They corrupted God's way, and there's violence throughout the earth. And the only thing he could do was flood the earth, destroy all life therein. But when Moses gets out, God starts to clarify a law here. And you see it in verses 4 to 6. Now there's 3 points he makes. Verse 4, the flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, ye shall not eat. And so his point is the blood represents man's life. Verse 5, surely your blood of your lives will I require at the hand of beast, at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. And so here we see a responsibility for murder. And the third point is in verse 6, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for the image of God made he man. And so here's the law, a life for a life. And so God's clarifying his views on murder. I mean, this was corrupted by Lamech back in chapter 4. But the problem was, though, with man with this law, they saw murder is murder. They couldn't distinguish between what we would call manslaughter and murder. And this is the background to Numbers chapter 35, because there's going to be a distinction made between manslaughter and murder. So Numbers 35, murder is defined in verse 16. If he smite him with an instrument of iron, so he die, he's a murderer. Verse 17, if he smite him with throwing a stone, wherewith he die, he's a murderer. If he smite him with a hand weapon of wood, that he die, he is a murderer. So there's very clear the definition of a murder. It's the intentional killing of another. Now there's motive behind this murder as well. If you look at verse 20, if he thrust him of hatred, or in lying of wait, that's a murderer. Verse 22 has the word, if he has enmity. Verse 23, if he sought him harm. So this is how they would judge, would be based on these. Did he have these kind of motives of the intentional killing of another? And that would be murder. The contrast, or the beside murder, there is manslaughter. And this is the unintentional killing of another. So you have in verse 22, if he thrust him suddenly without enmity, or cast anything upon him lying in wait. He says the same thing in verse 23. Right? So what the law is doing is making a distinction between intentional and unintentional killing. And we see this today. If I go out and kill somebody with a knife, that's murder, whereas if I do it by accident and say in a car accident, you get manslaughter. So we have the same distinction in our laws today. Now, the application of the law when something like this, actually, let's just take, there's a high-profile murder right now with those two high school students, right, where the one student stabbed the other student to death. Now, under the law, this is how it would work. The one who killed the other high school student, he would be in this case, he was the one who killed the other one. He would flee to a city of refuge. And he would sit in that city and wait for judgment. And the elders would come forth at the city gates, and they would hear his case. They would hear the witnesses. And they would decide, was this premeditated murder? Right? Did he intend to hurt him? Did he intend to kill him? Was it out of hate, harm, enmity? Or was it by accident? And their verdict would be one of two things. Manslaughter. If it was manslaughter, the result would be he would have to stay in that city. He could not leave that city until the death of the high priest. And he would be provide safety in that city from the Avenger of blood. Whereas if it was murder, the slayer in that instance would be given to the hand of the Avenger of blood, who was responsible to take his life. Because the Noah's law was a life for a life. You take someone's life, you're responsible to give up your own life or your blood. But in either case, it's interesting, between murder and manslaughter, just like the law of poverty, it still upholds responsibility for our actions, whether it's murder or manslaughter. Now, in the midst of all this background, we come across this term, goel. Now, in verse 12, he's termed the Avenger. Verse 19, he's the Avenger of blood. So the near kinsman in this case has the right, no, it's the duty to kill the slayer. Now, this is hard for us to grasp today because this is not the laws that we follow, but this was the Mosaic law at the time. They held a life for a life. There's responsibility there. And in this case, the role of the near kinsman was to avenge the death of his brother, to harmonize that Noah law. Now, where in the Old Testament would you go to see an example of this in action? Can you think of one? Let's go to 2 Samuel 14. Comes up in the life of David and his family. 2 Samuel 14, verse 11. 2 Samuel 14, verse 11, partway through, the revengers of blood to destroy anymore, to destroy my son. The revengers of blood, the goel. This is the Hebrew, this is the near kinsman, the redeemer. So this is so what's the context here? Well, in chapter 13, Absalom hated his brother Amnon. Why? Do you remember why? Raped his sister. Yeah. So, what does Absalom do? Absalom, in chapter 13, verse 28, he has Amnon killed. Well, this is a case of murder, isn't it? Now, where does Absalom flee? Does he go to a city of refuge? No, he goes outside of Israel to his grandfather's kingdom in Geshur. It's not a city of refuge, but under the law, if he was going to claim manslaughter, he should flee to one of the cities of refuge and be judged by the elders. And it would be a case of Absalom versus Amnon. Now, how would we judge this case? This is interesting, isn't it? Because was he justified in killing Amnon because he raped his sister? How do we judge this? Is it murder or manslaughter? Why? Verse 22, 13 verse 22. It gives you a key detail, right? We're not justifying rape in this case, but chapter 13 verse 22, wrong page. 13 verse 22, Absalom spake unto his brother neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon. Under the law, hate was motive for murder. And Absalom knew the law condemned him. And that's why he flees to his grandfather's kingdom. He's outside the land of Israel. He's trying to escape the law because it condemned him to death. Again, not justifying the actions of his brother, but in this case here, what he did was counted as murder. Now, what happens in chapter 14, Joab realizes that Absalom's out and David's a mess. David's struggling with just what happened in his family. And so Joab works through this woman of Tekoa to bring Absalom back into the community. He's kind of being his lawyer, if you will. And so he takes this woman to stand before David, and she tells this parable is what it is. In verse 6, she tells the story of her sons fought against each other, kind of like a Cain and Abel type of scenario, which resulted in the death of one of her sons. And verse 7, she says, here's the problem as she goes to David. He says, the family says we need to deliver the slayer to the near kinsman, right? Because they're pulling off of Numbers 35. And she wants to protect her living son from the avenger of blood because it would leave her with no heir. All right? And this is a problem. And so what does she do? Verse 11, she petitions David to protect her son from the law. Now, we know how the story plays out. David realizes it's a parable. But in the case of Absalom and Amnon, who should have the avenger of blood have been? Who should have took the life of Absalom? David. He should have been the avenger of blood. He has no problem using a sword, but he couldn't. His love for Absalom prevented him from following through. Now, we know the end of this story because Absalom comes back, right? David doesn't see him, but then he irritates his cousin Joab, burns his fields, right? So he makes an enemy out of his lawyer, and in the end, in his revolt, what happens? He loses his life. God takes his life by the hand of Joab. So he pays for what he did. He pays for this murder, because we have to restore the balance, right? A life for a life. But this is a great example of the law of the near kinsman, the avenger in action. But David, he was what? He was weak in the flesh, and he couldn't fulfill the role of the near kinsman. So God did it. Now, do we fault David? How many of us could have taken on the role of the near kinsman at that time? That would not have been easy. And so, we're just reading the story and we're looking at it, but you can understand how David would have just been so broken on what do I do with Absalom, because the law killed him. But he's like, what do I do? And that was his favorite son at that point. And it just highlights the law is not easy to follow. It's hard. These are hard things. Now, bringing our minds back to the nation of Israel and the redemption out of Egypt, how does this relate? Well, Pharaoh and the Egyptians, think about this. They were responsible for what? The death, the murder of many Israelites, including the children, right? Because what was the law? Cast those children into the river Nile, into that river of blood. But unlike Amnon, Israel has a near kinsman who takes on the role of the Avenger of blood. And that's Yahweh their God. Let's go to Psalms 106. The psalmist picks this up and highlights this point as God is the Avenger of blood, as the near kinsman. Psalms 106, verse 10. He saved them from the hand of him that hated them. Hate was a motive for murder. And he says he redeemed them from the hand of the enemy. Because Yahweh is Israel's near kinsman, like the Goel, the redemption process. Now look at verse 11. The waters covered their enemies. There was not one of them left. They killed the Israelite babies where? In the waters. And God says, yeah, I'm Israel's near kinsman. And he killed them to justify, right, to restore order for the murder in the Red Sea. Look at chapter 78, verse 53. This psalmist makes the same point. In Psalm 78, verse 53, he led them on safely, so they feared not. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies. Going back to they spilt blood, so God spilt their blood. And so God is their near kinsman. He acted as the role of the avenger of blood, and he took their life in the Red Sea. Now, interesting enough, Stephen picks up this same concept when he's speaking about Moses. Let's just quickly go over this Acts chapter 7. Stephen, his commentary on Moses in the wilderness, look at the words that he says. Acts chapter 7 and verse 24. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, this is back in Exodus chapter 2, he defended him. He avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian. How does Stephen refer to Moses? An avenger of blood. He was looking out for his brother who was being oppressed. He's described as near kinsman. So again, just to kind of summarize this, God redeemed the nation of Israel as their near kinsman. And these principles should bring into our minds that God delivered them out of bondage, right, out of poverty, as well as avenged their murder and avenged their death. Now, these are the kind of things that should come to our mind when we look at God as their Redeemer. Now, let's take a quick moment to look at the Hebrew word redeem. Now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any means. I understand a couple letters, and that's about it. But Hebrew's different than English, right? It's a language of roots and patterns. And so typically with Hebrew words, you'll start with what they call a parent root. Usually consists of two letters, and they'll branch out into other words. And so if you see Hebrew words with very similar letters, oftentimes they're related. This is how Hebrew works, not like that in English. And so what you see is, again, letters that are very similar often convey a similar idea or concept. They're linked. Now, the Hebrew word goel, do you know what the letters are for goel? We got a gimel, an aleph, and a lamed. Those are the three letters that make up the word for near kinsman. This is a concept of redeemed. Now, when you look this word up, so here's an example of someone who's taken the parent root, which is gal for lamed, and he's broken it down. He's going to list a bunch of words that come from it. And so you notice the kind of words it's associated with: round, mound, wheel, and so on. And so when we talk about gal, we can think of words like that are physical, like a circle or a mound. Gilgal, right? GLGL, that means, that comes out of this root, and it's a wheel. So these words are associated, but it also can be metaphoric, because the idea of round, something goes in circles in time or an event. And when you think of redemption, what is that? It's circular, isn't it? You go into poverty and the Redeemer brings you out. It restores you, perhaps maybe is another word, right? The murderer kills, and then you take the murderer's life. You have this circular kind of understanding. It's a metaphor, this concept to restore order. There's harmony in the principle of redemption. Now, what I found interesting, though, is this word right here. As I'm working through these words, is the word for skull. What word is that? GL. You know what word that is in the Hebrew? I know you just put some O's in there. What is it? It's Golgotha. Golgotha, that word links our minds to this concept of the redemption process. So let's go to John chapter 19. Look at the narrative here. I mean, where does this bring us, right? We're going to the crucifixion of Christ. This is the work of Christ on the cross. Well, John 19 and verse 17, bearing his cross, he went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha. And so the narrative is bringing our attention of the Hebrew word skull, which is Golgotha. And so Jesus is taking on this role of the near kinsman who's going to work to restore or redeem us out of the bondage of king sin and death. So we see these principles, they're starting to overlap. Now, just a few references as Jesus as our Redeemer. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 1. I'm just thinking of these concepts of the near kinsman. 1 Peter chapter 1. Verse 18 and 19. For as much as ye know that you are not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold, or from your vain conversations received by traditions from your father, but with the precious blood of Christ. And so isn't this the language of the near kinsman? Right? The idea of redemption. We're not redeemed with money. You can't buy your way out of king sin. You can't. The works of the law won't save you out of king sin. It's only through the precious blood of Christ, a life given, that we can receive redemption. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 2. Another strong passage we often use when we're speaking about the crucifixion of Christ. Verse 14. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil. And so we see this is in reference to Golgotha, right? We're dealing with Christ on the cross. But look what he says in verse 15. And deliver them who through the fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. That's the language back in Exodus, of Israel's Exodus. They're subject to bondage, and we need a redeemer. We need someone to pull us out of that life. Now, who's the devil in verse 14? It's a good question. Well, we know it's not a supernatural fallen angel in any way, but the devil here is described as having the power of death. Who else had the power of death? Or who else is death associated? Well, let's just keep your finger here and let's go to John 8. Look what Jesus says about the description of death. John 8 and 44, he's going to link our minds back to Numbers 35. John 8 and 44, he's looking out and he says, ye are of your father, the devil. So we're linked to Hebrews 2:14. And the lusts of your father you will do. And what does he call the devil here? He was a murderer from the beginning. And so Jesus claims the devil is a murderer. And who's he referencing? We know it's the serpent. But this is bringing our minds back to Numbers chapter 35 and the law of murder. Because if he was a murderer from the beginning, to restore order, you have to take the life of the devil. And so what does Christ do? We know he puts to death, Hebrews 2:14, he puts to death the devil. Or we can say the serpent. Where? At Golgotha, the place of the skull, as our near kinsman. Let's just Go to Romans chapter 5. We were here in the first class, and we left off in Romans 5 and 6 that the problem, we're born under king's sin, bondage, and death. And we're described as servants of sin. But Paul says there's a solution to this. Chapter 6, verse 22. But being made free from sins, you become servants to God. And if you're servants of God, you have everlasting life. This is the solution to bondage and death, is servants to God and everlasting life. Verse 18, you can become servants of righteousness. And so just like the nation became God's servants in the wilderness, we can become God's servants. And we know what it means to become God's servants. It requires a change in us, right? A change in our attitude. Verse 17, that we were the servants of his sin, but you've obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered unto you. Verse 22, we should have fruit unto holiness. So we expect to have this change in nature, not just lust after things of Egypt. But as far as how do we become part of the redemptive process of Christ? Christ did the work. He put to death the murderer. All right, and he's offering eternal life. We see it's a change of nature, but we have to do something else. We have to become associated with this. We can't be strangers living in the land. You have to be a part of this redemptive process. And what is it? Verse 3 and 4. Know ye not that so many of us were baptized into Jesus Christ, were baptized into his death? We're a part of his death. That's what baptism is. So we're buried with him by baptism and death. And just like as Christ is raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, we should walk in newness of life. Do you want to see this? Israel was part of their own redemptive process. God worked through them to bring them out. Yes, God did the miracles. He took the plagues. He brought them to Mount Horeb. He did those things. But it's with the people. It's not a judgment like this. And here we see we're associated with the redemptive work of Christ through baptism. We can't be a stranger sitting there in the land. Now look at verse 6. Look at the language. Knowing this, our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, and henceforth not serve sin. So we're given other titles. This is words. We've seen king sin, we've seen devil, we've seen the old man, we've seen the body of sin. These are all ways to describe the nature or the position we're in. And that we're subject to king sin. We're subject to mortality. However you want to explain it. Paul gives us lots of words and terms to describe the problem we face. That's mortality and death. But he's provided a way out of this. Let's end. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul again is going to pull from the Exodus. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Moreover, verse 1, moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were passed under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So even Israel, the redemptive process, we see the hand of the Avenger and deliverer out of there, but they were still baptized through going through the process of the Red Sea. And it's the same sea, interesting enough, that puts to death who? Pharaoh, king of Egypt, right, with his servants and those that are his. Now, I just want to close this off with a challenge, because the nation of Israel, redeemed by God, the mighty hand of God, they were baptized in the Red Sea. Yet, what does verse 5 to 8 highlight? It highlights their failures. Verse 5, but with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. And they were examples because they were full of lusts, living after the natural things. And they did idolatry to adultery. They fell away. God did all these great things. And these people, they fell away. And so do we see the challenge here, brothers and sisters? We've been, most of us here are probably baptized, or perhaps thinking about baptism. We've been redeemed from serving king sin. Right? We can serve God now, but the question is, how do we live? Are we serving God or sin in our lives? It's a challenge that we should be thinking about daily on who we are serving in our lives. The next class, we're going to move forward in a bit of time, and we're going to skip over to when Israel stands before God at Mount Sinai, and we're going to look at this from a bit of a prophetic view to see how this points forward to the events concerning the kingdom.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching. And remember to come back soon.